Craig Smoak.
Thanks to Brigham Young's Kalani Sitake. Jeff Howe, who covers Texas on their surge as they have every year at the end of right before National Signing Day, plus the transfer of Quinn Ewers, and also Kendall Count breaks down Baylor, Villanova, and the basketball team. At 4:45, we're joined by Hall of Famer John McClain in the Houston Chronicle, normally with us on Tuesdays. I called John earlier today, and I asked him if he could come on earlier because of the passing of the great Dave Campbell on Friday evening. Jerry Hill will join us in about an hour and a half, who was very close to Dave Campbell as well. John, you obviously knew that Dave had not been doing well. Your thoughts about Dave Campbell?
Oh, I would like to say that when I got to the Texans game against the Seahawks yesterday, I get to the games about 3 hours early, and I noticed that a seat was this huge thing of flowers. And I walked over there, and I looked, and it was a Texas football magazine. The Texans had reserved a seat for Dave in the press box in RG Stadium. So I immediately took a picture, tweeted it, and got retweeted all over the country, NFL people. It was such a class thing for the Texans to do, and their team president, Greg Grissom, came up with the idea. He grew up in Texas like so many of us, and he said, in the summer, he did like we did. You run down, get Texas Football Magazine, and you couldn't wait to read every word. And first of all, I'd like to say condolences to Dave's daughters, Becky and Julie, and to all of his friends and friends. At 96, it was coming at some point, but it was still a gut punch. I was at dinner with my wife and a friend from the Seahawks. I got the text, and I was just, caught totally off guard. And I sat there at dinner while the two of them talked, and I just started having memories. I had to take my napkin and start wiping my eyes because I kept getting tears going back to when my dad first handed me the Waco Tribune Herald. And he said, John Craig, if you want to learn about Baylor, you got to read Dave Campbell. And I started reading him, and I couldn't understand half the words because I was so young. But I had become a Baylor fan when I was 8 years old. And so I used to read him. And I always thought reading Dave Campbell and listening to Frank Fallon, those were like the voices of God. And the only other person I've ever thought that about was Tom Landry. And I'll say this about Dave. He would be so embarrassed about all this attention he's getting, columns all over the state, tributes to him. And he was so humble and so gracious. He never wanted attention. He got a lot of attention. He's kind of like Dave Aranda doesn't want attention, but the better you do, the more attention you're going to get. And that's the way it was with Dave. And a good example of that, I tried to get Dave for years to allow media people to go into the Texas Sports Hall of Fame. And he was there at the committee, and he said, no. He said, we're supposed to report the news, not make the news. And I told him, and he just wouldn't hear of it. And I knew it's because he knew that if we did it, he was going in, and he didn't think he deserved it. So one time, 15 years ago, he called me at our annual meeting, first Tuesday in June, at the Hall of Fame. He asked me if I would run the meeting for him because he had to go to a funeral and be a pallbearer. And I said, sure. So we get in there, and Steve Fallon was the executive director, one of my oldest and best friends going back to high school. And we started talking, and David, I'm sure you were there. Brad Sham, I think, brought this up. Well, what do we got to do to put media people into the Texas Sports Hall of Fame? And Steve Fallon said, well, it's against the bylaws. And I said, well, can't we change the bylaws? And he said, well, we've never had a situation like this. And so he looked in the bylaws and found out we could, and we did.
Yep.
And we voted on the icons of Texas journalism, and there were 4 writers, Dave Campbell, Blackie Sherrod, Dan Jenkins, and Mickey Herskowitz, and 4 broadcasters, Frank Fallon, Jack Dale, Kern Tips, and Vern Lundquist. And we said at that time, we'll never do it again. So it took a while to do that. Then we got into our regular nominating, and here comes Dave. And he goes, oh, y'all are still here. And he had Reba with him. And he walks into the room, and it got really quiet. because everybody knew he wasn't going to like what we just did. And I remember somebody saying, well, John, you tell him. And he said, tell me what? And I said, well, we just voted a class of sports writers and sports broadcasters into the Hall of Fame, icons of Texas journalists. He said, well, you can't do that. That's against the bylaws. We changed them, didn't we, Steve? And Steve Fowler, yes, Mr. Campbell, we did. And he said, well, we can't do that. We're not going to do that. So we've done it. Well, we're going to change it back. And so Reba comes over to me and leans down. And she says, while he was arguing against it, she goes, honey, he'll do it. He loves it. He just don't want to act like it. And he did. We did, and we had that induction in conjunction with Touchdown Club of Houston at the JW Marriott here. And Dave asked me if I would introduce him, and I did. And it's one of the best honors of my life. And I'm so glad we did it, because he's certainly deserving of that honor with the other icons of Texas journalism.
What was it like to have him as a boss?
Well, I'll tell you, Paul, I got hired in 1973 by Hollis Biddle, his right-hand man. Dave was always so busy. He wrote his columns for the Trib, and he was always working on Texas football. Then he did Arkansas football. Then he did a Cowboy magazine. And so we would love for him to come into the sports department, his office right around the corner. And sometime he would come in and sit, and we're like, want to gather around and hear him. And all of a sudden, his phone would ring in his office. His phone was always ringing. And we made things, well, we need to go in there and unplug it so he'll come in here and have time to talk to us. And he would bring in the sports sections from around the state, which he read every day. And that's how I got to reading the Houston Chronicle and the Houston Post, the Morning News and Star Telegram and two San Antonio papers and Austin American Statesman. We'd like fight over them when he would drop them off. And it was amazing. He was a tremendous editor and not just a tremendous writer. Dave was an English. I can't remember if he majored in English or minored in it, but he was a tough editor for Texas football. First story I wrote for him, it had my name on it, but it wasn't my story because he'd rewritten it. Of course, I wasn't going to tell anybody because it was a great story. And they're like, wow, you just started. I can't imagine you could write like that. And I puffed my chest out, and it was years before I had enough confidence in myself as a sports writer to admit the truth. Well, Dave Campbell rewrote that story. And he was a tremendous editor, and so many people call him Darrell Royal, Grant Sapp, Bill Yeoman, Frank Broyles, the coaches, Gene Stallings. They would all call Dave and seek his counsel because they trusted him and because they knew whatever they talked to him about, he wasn't going to burn them. And I'll never forget one of my favorite stories, 1979. I'd been at the Chronicle since 76. And Baylor pulled a huge upset over Texas at Baylor Stadium. And another one of my oldest friends from high school, Robert Miller, who grew up there, he calls me, and I happened to be at the Chronicle on a Sunday. I'd covered a Oilers game, and he says, we just ran into Mike Singletary, and I can't remember what restaurant off campus it was. He told us the weirdest story. I said, what? That he told us that before the game, Taft ate a worm. I said, what? That's what he said. Taft ate a worm to fire up the team. Ate a worm? A real worm? He said, that's what Singletary said. He said, I'm just letting you know. And I'm like, okay. So I tell the night editor at sports, and he tells our Southwest Conference writer who's working on his Southwest Conference follow, call Singletary and ask him if Taft ate a worm. Well, back then you could call players, you had their numbers. So I'm listening to Jerry Wizard call Mike Singletary. He goes, hey, Mike, Jerry Wizard at the Chronicle. How you doing, Oz? Congratulations. Listen, we got this report that sounds preposterous, but I just thought I would follow up with you. He said, John McClain here got a call from a friend of his that saw you and said you told him, and he started laughing. Now, I know this is not right, but you told him that Grant ate a worm. Huh? What? He did? Hold on. He covers up the phone and says, he did eat a worm. So he wrote the story with Singletary quoted. We got a scoop on it. Campbell told me later he was holding it for his column that would run on Tuesday. And I said, Mr. Campbell, I said, do you remember when you used to say, I asked you for advice on covering a pro beat? And he told me, he said, write it or read it. And I said, you didn't follow your own advice. You didn't write it, and you had to read it. And he kind of shrugged his shoulders, but he was such a great man. I could talk to you guys for 2 hours telling Dave Campbell stories. I'm honored that Becky and Julie, his daughters, have asked me if I will speak at the service on Friday. And she said, Becky said, when Dad retired, you told some great stories about him, and we'd be honored. And I said, I would too. It's a privilege. So David Barron, who worked at the Trib, just retired from the Chronicle last year. He and I don't know who else they got, but we'll be there telling Dave Campbell stories, and then we'll be over at Texas Sports Hall of Fame for the reception afterward.
John, can you begin to describe the impact that Dave Campbell had on the city of Waco in particular?
Well, first of all, he came back. He grew up in Belmead, and he went into World War II, and he came out. And he didn't like to talk about that. He was in some serious battles. And Jinx Tucker was the sports center. I remember my dad telling me Jinx Tucker. And when I was a kid, and I'm like, what's a Jinx Tucker? And he told me it was his name. And I said, who would name somebody Jinx? But my dad, and then when Dave took Jinx Tucker's place, the Trib had, I think, 2 sports editors in 60-something years. And Dave was a great writer. And he took a lot of time. Some of the greatest things he wrote were when people died. I think maybe the greatest thing I ever saw him write was there was a guy that used to work before I got there named George Rayburn. And George Rayburn died, and Campbell wrote this long column, and I must have read it 10 times. It was so good and so personal and so vivid. And he was a terrific writer, and we all wanted to emulate him. But nobody was going to be able to. And there were some great sports writers in Texas then. Blackie Sherrod, Dan Jenkins, Sam Blair, Bob St. John, Burl Pettit, Jack Gallagher, Mickey Herskowitz in Houston, Clark Nealon. Those guys were all giants. And those of us in college and sport, everybody wanted to be in newspapers then because of Watergate. The Washington Post had brought down the presidency. And I remember when Bob Woodward spoke at Baylor, everybody wanted to go. And I was fortunate enough to be working for the Trib. I in June of '73 started doing Friday night football in September of '72, and so everybody read Dave. And Dave, his impact on because of Texas football. It's one thing to be a sports editor of the Waco Tribune Herald, but his reach, because of the magazine and because of what he did with Arkansas Football Magazine, it extended to the border states, and people knew him. Albert Breer, who works for Sports Illustrated and has never worked in Texas, Ohio State grad who went to Boston Globe, he retweeted today in his Monday morning quarterback column my picture of the Tribune in the Texans press box with a comment, something about what a legend Dave was in the state of Texas. And I thought that was very cool. And people knew him all over the country. And because he was such a gentleman, too, one of the coolest things, Tom Stanton, when he was AD at Baylor, he and Dave were really close. And Tom got the press box at Old Baylor Stadium named after him. And I don't know why. At McLean Stadium, they haven't named it after him. They've still got everything that was in there. Drayton was one of his best friends. And so, anyway, Tom and I went to Dave's house, and Reba kind of gave us a run of the place for the press box. And there was a picture of the whole Southwest Conference press tour where the newspaper writers and columnists would travel around the state in Arkansas doing preseason football stories. Those were as big a read in the state as Texas football. And there was a picture of all these writers doing a pyramid on the grass outside of a stadium. And that was Blackie Sherrod, Dan Jenkins, Dave. And on the top, because he was the smallest, top off the pyramid, was Mickey Herskowitz from Houston. And it was just a classic picture. And I don't know if it's over there. Baylor's got it stored somewhere, but I'd sure like to get my hands on it. But Dave was influential with everybody. And you think when I started writing for Texas football high schools, he'd say, young men, get as many names as you can in there, because the mamas and the daddies and the kids and their friends and their relatives, they all want to see those names in there. And for every name you get in there, that's magazine sales. And so I would put as many names possible. David Barron was the editor forever, and he made sure that was the case too, because it meant so many. And one time about 20 years ago, this would have been in the early 90s. Gosh, yeah. They had the Touchdown Club of Houston honored Dave as Touchdowner of the Year. There's one a year. And that was people like Jill Namath and Bear Bryant, Darrell Royal had won that. There were only a couple of media people that had been honored. And they invited everybody that had been on the cover of Texas Football Magazine to come to that banquet. And they all showed up, and they were up at the head table, and each of them got up and talked about what Texas football meant to them and their families. And Dave, of course, is sitting there boring and bored because he didn't like the attention. But listening to those guys, many of them had gone on to be stars in the NFL, talking about couldn't sleep the night before the magazine was supposed to be on the stands, and their mother calling the stores, the drug stores, the grocery stores, the bookstores, when is it going to be out? And I remember Lloyd Wainscott, who played at UT, talking about the Boulash family from Lamarck. Their parents bought every magazine and every place that you could find down in that part of the state. And the Boulash family was so angry because they had to go way away to get some copies. And that's what it meant. And because I'm older and I don't write for Texas football anymore, I'm not sure about the impact. But back then, everybody wanted it as soon as it came out. And if you got a copy before others got it, you were the coolest kid on the block. And I had a professor at Baylor. Boy, Baylor won't like to hear this, but I'm going to tell you guys. I needed to graduate, and I needed one class. And I went to this professor, and I said, I need help. I'm stupid. I already got a job. I need one class. I'll show up every day, even though I work 60 hours a week. Is there anything I can do that where you can help me graduate? And he said, you work for Dave Campbell, right? I said, I do. He said, you work for Texas football? And I said, yes. He said, if you can get me a copy of that magazine before any of my other friends, you take my class and you come every day and you work hard, and I'll make sure you graduate. So I went with Dave, and Dave would never have gone along with us. I've never told the story publicly. I went with Dave to the printer, and the first copy, literally, he had to wear gloves, hot off the presses, and he always took the first one. And I can't remember what cockamamie story I told him of why I needed the second one. Might have told him somebody died. I don't remember. And so he gave it to me, and it was hot off the presses. I got to the professor's house like 4 a.m, banged on his door, and said, here it is. So he said, show up every day. And I did, and I made an effort. And I don't know what I would have made on my own, probably an F-, but I graduated.
Well,
thanks to Texas Football Magazine.
Yeah. John, you got anything else? We could talk forever, and I hope you'll be able to jump back on with us again tomorrow at 5:30 to talk many other things as well. But Craig and Paul both in certain ways brought this up about him. In this day and age of what everything is me, and the way we are, the way the professional has gone, and even like high school football commitments, the transfer portal, I don't know if he wanted to be around for any of that. Did he?
I wouldn't think so, but Dave learned to adjust with the times. You know, he was old school from a different era, and he believed in being factual, and he believed in checking your sources and being accountable. He would never let you just throw something out there and hope it's stuck on the wall like so many do today. He had so much honor, and I don't know of anybody that was more honorable. The three people most responsible for me being where I am today, were Dave Campbell, David McCann, head of journalism at Baylor, who's 88. I just saw him 2 weeks ago, and Tony Peterson, who got me hired in Waco, got me hired in Houston, and we were roommates at Baylor. And then he put me on the Oilers way back when. And without those three, and McCann and Tony considered Dave their mentor as well. And it's amazing. I can't wait to see there'll be people all over the state and the country coming to his funeral to honor him.
John, thank you very much. John McClain, Hall of Fame
Thank
writer
you, guys.
on the
Check
icon and legend, and Dave Campbell. Grant Tapp put out a comment. His daughter Lane put out a couple of comments that he made about Dave Campbell. Last week Bill Glass. Last week Dave Campbell. And you see all these icons and legends, not just from Waco, Baylor, or the state of Texas, but elsewhere. When we come back, Jeff Howe covers UT football. They had the commitment from Quinn Ewers, South Lake Carroll. This is when he was supposed to commit and sign anyway. But, of course, we know he had the trip to Ohio State and all of that. Jeff Howe next on Sikkim 365 Radio.